Foreign had been somewhat ruined by an experience I had when I was younger. I think so often back to the time my experience happened. Nobody ever believed my story at the time, so I decided to write it now for the world to see. It began really when I was 14 or so, when my family moved home. My dad had been offered a job with better pay, and a mere week later we had sold our house and rented an apartment in the town we moved to. It was during the summer we moved, so it was simple starting at my new school. When term began, I nervously walked from our apartment building to the school, which was rather close. I hadn't had the chance to meet any local kids, so I didn't know anybody and was scared of having to make new friends all alone. I don't recall really speaking to anybody that morning. I was too shy. I just took my timetable in a slightly trembling hand and looked to see what my first class was. Math in room 104. I checked the little school map handout I had been given. I looked at that map over and over. I couldn't see my class number at all, and by then no staff were around me, and I began to panic. Where the hell do I go? I noticed on the layout of the building that there was a whole section to the right of the school that seemed to have plenty of classroom-sized rooms, but no numbers. Class numbers on the far left of the school were numbers 300 to 310. The center of the building had rooms designated in the 200 to 230 range. I decided my classroom, 104, would logically be to the right. I walked down long corridors. Most of the other students were not new, and so they had already made it to their classes, while I contemplated my map. Because of this, the corridors were now deserted. In retrospect, I should have just found the help desk and asked them to give me directions, but I was so shy I'd rather try and do it alone. Anyway, I followed the building layout. At the end of an eerily quiet and long corridor, my passage was blocked by a rather old-looking wooden double door that didn't open when I pushed. This seemed wrong, like this part of the building was not meant to be entered. I played with the idea that someone had accidentally shut them, or maybe I just wasn't pushing hard enough. I rammed into the doors with my shoulder, and with the scraping sound of metal on wood, they opened. I realized then that I had broken the bolts on the other side of the door, which were brittle with rust. Horrified at having broken a door lock on my first day, I was about to turn and run from the scene, and just ask someone to help me find my class. I obviously shouldn't be in this part of the school. The new corridor was old and dusty. The lockers were all hanging open and unused, and a faint smell of mold hung in the air. But as I turned, I noticed the numbers painted on the glass windows of the doors along the corridor. The one nearest to me read 100. Perplexed, I checked my timetable again to assure myself that I had read my class number correctly. It was clear my room was 104, and just along this corridor, apparently. I began to walk slowly, looking into the windows of each class I passed. 100 empty, 101 empty, 102 empty, except for a plastic skeleton hanging in the corner by a pile of yellowing student lab coats. But still, it was enough to make me flinch. As I checked 103, it was empty. I heard the voice of an adult man coming from the room opposite room 104. I peeked through the window. Full. Except it wasn't what I expected to see. Sure, there was a teacher wearing a worn brown suit and blue bow tie, and there were students all focused on this teacher, sitting apart from one another on old-fashioned wooden tables. What made me pause was what they were wearing. Kids didn't dress like that anymore. It looked like a classroom from an old film or show. The teacher stood beside a blackboard, dusty from chalk. Despite this oddity, I knocked on the door. I assumed the school had a poor budget. The teacher didn't notice my knocking, so I quietly opened the door and walked in. None of the students took their gaze away from the teacher, who also paid no attention to me. I awkwardly apologized for my lateness, deciding that I had gotten lost. I then made my way over to the only free seat in the room, and I sat down. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. I must have interrupted the class. The teacher began his lesson a few seconds later, rather casually. His name was Mr. Talori. He began to chalk equations on the board and got the class to solve them. The lesson was rather ordinary, except for the fact no calculators were used. Whenever I raised my hand to answer a question, almost trying to win back favor from the teacher, he ignored it and always chose another student to answer the problem. The lesson ended abruptly after what felt like hours. By the end of it, I was bored and miserable. I just wanted to get home and complain about the way I was ignored. When I left the room, I felt pangs of hunger. I noticed that my watch was shocked to see the school day had ended. The whole day of math horror. I had decided I hated that school. I walked slowly home, going over the day's events in my mind. It was all very weird, but I suppose I would get used to this new school eventually. When I got home, my mother was talking on the home phone. Her face displayed confusion. She heard me come in and frowned when she saw me. She looked somewhat angry and asked whoever was on the other end of the phone line to hold. She then accused me of skipping school. Confusion followed. I told her I was in class all day, but apparently the school had phoned to say I wasn't in any lessons and hadn't seen me after I collected my timetable. I said I was in Mr. Talori's class in room 104 all day. I must have missed the register when I was late, I thought. My mom paused and told the school on the phone my story. Her expression froze after a few seconds, and then she looked at me rather worriedly. She hung up the phone and told me what the school had said. Mr. Talori had not worked at that school in 38 years. Apparently, room 104 was part of an abandoned section of the school that hadn't been used since the school caught fire nearly 40 years ago. The school thought I was playing some sick joke. That night, I went on the web to find out if what the school said was true, and quickly I found an old newspaper article about the school's massacre that had been archived. A madman had simply walked into the school with a flaming Molotov cocktail and threw it into a classroom on that wing. He had blocked all the doorways. There was an old grainy photo that showed where it had happened, and I recognized that immediately. It was room 104. An obituary showed tributes to the dead and photos of all that had died. I recognized them too. Mr. Talori and all the students I had spent a day with. My heart felt like it had stopped. I felt sick. I felt cold to my bones at that moment, and after that day, I changed schools. Now, years later, I've written this, my account of what happened to me, which nobody had ever believed. The reason why now? Well, you see, yesterday I received the letter in the post. There was no address. It had simply appeared in my letterbox. It was a class reunion invite signed by my old teacher, Mr. Talori. He didn't answer immediately, but when he did, his voice was hollow, as if someone else was speaking through him. It's here, Sarah. It's always been here. In the walls, in the dark. Watching. Waiting. Watching. Her heart skipped a beat. What do you mean watching? It watches us. It listens. It knows everything. That was when the nightmares started. Not just for Lily, but for Sarah as well. In the dead of night, she would wake to the sound of whispers, thin, rasping voices that seemed to come from the very air itself. She would sit up in bed, her body trembling, and the whispers would stop, only to start again, louder now and closer. She saw things in the dark, shapes moving behind the walls, shadows that twisted into grotesque, half-formed faces. She could hear faint breathing, like someone was in the room with H. And then came the dreams. She saw a figure, tall and skeletal, with hollow, burning eyes. It reached out from the darkness and tried to touch her, to drag her into the walls. The walls would bleed, and she could feel the coldness, the desperation. She could hear the thing whispering her name, calling her into the depths of the house. The final straw came one night when Lily disappeared. The house was silent, too silent. Sarah woke to find her daughter's bed empty, the window cracked open, and the faintest trace of snow scattered across the floor. She searched the entire house, calling out for her, but there was no sign of her. The walls, however, were different. They seemed to pulse, as if alive, as if something was moving beneath them. Sarah screamed Lily's name, but only the silence answered. In the kitchen, she found Thomas standing still, his eyes wide and unblinking. He didn't respond when she spoke to him. When she touched his shoulder, he turned to her with a vacant stare. His lips parted and he whispered, in a voice that was not his own, "She's with it now. In the walls. Forever." Desperate, Sarah fled into the woods, screaming for help, but no one ever came. The house was abandoned a week later, but the town spoke of strange happenings, of strange figures seen in the woods, of whispers on the wind, of a house that was never truly empty. And the scratching in the walls? It never stopped. The forest was older than anyone could remember, a place of thick, twisted trees that blocked out the sun, and a silence so profound that it felt like the world itself had been swallowed whole. A place where the wind never whispered, and the birds never sang. It was a place known to the townspeople as Hollow Grove, a place that people spoke of in hushed tones, if they spoke of it at all. No one dared enter it, for fear of the things that lurked within its depths. But as legend had it, the trees were not just trees, and the wind was not just wind. There was something else, something far darker. Thomas Blake had never been one to believe in local legends or supernatural tales. He was a man of science, of reason. When he moved to the small town of Larkspur, tucked away in the shadow of Hollow Grove, he thought little of the local superstitions. His family, himself, his wife Rachel, and their young daughter, Emma, had bought a house on the outskirts of town, a place that seemed to beckon with promise. It was isolated, quiet, and the perfect spot to escape the noise and stress of city life. The house was an old Victorian mansion, creaking with age, but beautiful in its own way. The perfect haven. Still, there was a coldness to the place, an unnatural stillness. The moment they moved in, Thomas noticed the silence. It wasn't just the quiet of rural living, it was something more. The wind didn't blow through the trees as it should have. The distant howls of wolves or the chirps of crickets were absent. The only sounds that seemed to fill the air were the occasional creaks of the house as it settled and the faint rustle of leaves that appeared to come from nowhere. Rachel dismissed his concerns as the anxiety of adjusting to a new life. "It's just the isolation, Thomas. It'll pass," she said, trying to comfort him. But even she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Every night, as they lay in bed, a sensation of being watched crept over them, as if invisible eyes were studying their every move. The children had the most trouble adjusting. Emma, their bright-eyed daughter, refused to play outside, despite the abundance of space. She would peer out of the window at the distant trees of Hollow Grove, her face pressed against the glass, watching something only she could see. Emma's imagination, Thomas told himself, was just running wild. After all, she was only 7. But one afternoon, after a particularly gloomy day of rain, Emma came running into the house, her eyes wide with terror. "They're out there, Daddy. The people," she said, pointing toward the trees, her voice trembling. Thomas, bewildered, knelt down to her level. "What people, Emma?" "The ones who live in the forest," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ones in the trees. They want me to come." Thomas had brushed it off at the time, chalking it up to an overactive imagination fueled by the isolation. Still, something about her words stuck with him. "The ones in the trees," he repeated, unsettled. Days turned into weeks, and though the family tried to make the best of their new life, the house seemed to press in on them. The oppressive silence grew heavier, as if the very land around them was holding its breath. Emma continued to talk about the people in the forest, about how they called to her at night. She would often wander to the edge of the trees and just stand there, her little form barely visible in the twilight, staring into the darkening woods. Thomas tried to ignore it. He took to checking on her when he could, making sure she wasn't getting too close to Hollow Grove, but the calls from the forest became more insistent. At night, when he would lie awake in bed, he could hear a faint whispering, a soft murmur that seemed to come from the direction of the trees. It was a language he couldn't understand, the words flowing like a current beneath the silence of the night. One evening, when Thomas was returning from town, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was a woman, dressed in tattered clothes that seemed to blend with the shadows. Her face was obscured by a long, dark veil, but Thomas could sense her presence, like the very air around her had thickened, like time itself had slowed. "Hello!" Thomas called out, his voice cracking in the eerie stillness. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she turned and began walking toward the grove, vanishing into the dense thicket as if swallowed whole by the forest itself. Thomas stood frozen for a moment, a sense of dread creeping into his chest. Something was wrong. He wasn't sure why, but everything about this place felt wrong. That night, when he returned home, Rachel greeted him with an odd look in her eyes. I think something's happening, Thomas," she said, her voice shaking. "I've been hearing things. I can't explain it, but I think the house is alive." "What do you mean?" he asked, sitting down beside her. "It's like the walls are whispering," she said, her hand trembling as she reached for his. "And I saw someone in the garden last night, standing by the tree. Just standing there, watching us." Thomas didn't know what to say. It was clear now that whatever was happening, it wasn't just in his head. They weren't alone. The house, the land, it was as if they were being hunted. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The whispering grew louder, and the walls seemed to shift with it, creaking and groaning as if trying to break free. He got out of bed and, unable to resist, grabbed his flashlight and went outside to investigate. The air was heavy with fog, and the faint glow of the moon filtered through the mist, casting eerie shadows over the landscape. He walked toward the edge of Hollow Grove, where the trees loomed like silent sentinels, their dark branches twisting and gnarled. As he approached, he heard it, a low, guttural sound, like something breathing just beyond the tree line. A voice whispered his name, its tone hollow and distant. "Thomas!" He froze. His heart thudded in his chest as he scanned the darkness, his eyes darting to the shadows between the trees. Something was moving out there, something that shouldn't be. "Thomas!" He took a step back, and that's when he saw her again, the woman in the veil. This time, she was standing just beyond the treeline, her dark silhouette watching him, her pale hands gripping the edges of her veil as if it were a shroud. Her eyes, though hidden, seemed to gleam with a malevolent light. Before he could call out to her, a strange feeling washed over him. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, and the trees seemed to bend toward him, as if they were alive, reaching out to touch him. Without thinking, he turned and ran back toward the house, his heart pounding in his chest. He burst through the front door, slamming it behind him and locking it tightly. Rachel was awake, sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you see her?" Thomas gasped, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Rachel didn't answer immediately. She looked toward the window, her expression unreadable. Slowly she nodded. "Yes. She's been standing there, watching us every night. But it's not just her. It's something else. Something worse." The next day, Emma went missing. It happened in the blink of an eye. One moment, she was in the yard, playing near the old oak tree, and the next, she was gone. Thomas and Rachel searched frantically, calling her name, but there was no answer. No sign of her anywhere. The only clue was the faintest trace of footprints in the wet ground, leading toward Hollow Grove. Thomas felt his blood run cold. This was no longer a simple mystery. It was something much darker, something ancient. Together, they ventured into the forest, following the trail. As they moved deeper into the trees, the air grew colder, and the whispering voices returned, echoing all around them. The branches above seemed to groan in agony, their twisted forms reaching down like skeletal fingers. The trees began to feel like prison bars, closing in on them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached a clearing. There, in the center, stood Emma, her back turned to them. She was staring at something, her body still as stone. "Emma!" Rachel screamed, running toward her. "Emma, where have you been?" But Emma didn't move. Her eyes were wide open, but there was no recognition in them, only an empty, hollow stare. And then, as if the forest itself had come alive, the trees shifted. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and a deep, resonating sound filled the air, like the very earth was groaning. A shape began to emerge from the shadows, the thing that had been waiting. It was a figure, tall and robed in dark, flowing garments. Its face was obscured by a hood, but Thomas could feel its eyes on him, as if they pierced into his very soul. "It's too late," the voice said, a deep, bone-chilling whisper. "She belongs to the grove now." And with that, the trees closed in. The house was abandoned a week later. The forest, once quiet, was alive with whispers and shadows, as if the land itself had claimed the family. The people in the town of Larkspur still speak of Hollow Grove, but they do so in whispers. And some say, if you listen closely on a still night, you can hear the voices of the lost calling from the trees. The forest waits. It always waits. The town of Raven Hollow had a secret, one that was buried deep in the earth and hidden beneath layers of time. The kind of secret that no one spoke of out loud. It wasn't written in any history books, nor was it passed down through generations as an old tale. The secret was simply known, whispered among the town's oldest inhabitants. They would say it in hushed voices, their eyes darting nervously to the shadows before continuing on. "Stay away from the hollow." It was a warning, but it was always accompanied by a look, one of knowing. It was a look that seemed to understand things that no one else dared speak of. The hollow, to the uninitiated, was simply a grove of trees located at the edge of town. To the residents, it was far more than that. It was a place where the past and present blurred, a place where things that should never have been were trapped. Emma and Jack Turner didn't know any of this when they moved to Raven Hollow. They were young and eager for a fresh start. Jack had taken a new job in the small, picturesque town as a mechanic, and Emma, a photographer, was looking for a quiet place to focus on her art. Their two young children, Lily and Ben, were excited to explore the woods that bordered their new home. It was everything they had dreamed of, quiet, peaceful, and far removed from the city's chaos. Their new house was an old Victorian, like so many in Raven Hollow. It was large, with a sweeping porch and a garden that had long since been overtaken by wild vines and shrubs. Emma was immediately taken with the charm of the place, though there was something about it that felt off. The air always seemed thick, as though the house itself were holding its breath. It wasn't long before they made their first trip to the edge of the hollow. It was an afternoon, the sky gray and heavy with clouds, a storm rolling in. Jack had taken the kids out to explore, and Emma stayed behind to unpack a few boxes. But when she heard their voices from the edge of the woods, she felt a chill run up her spine. "Mom, look at this!" Lily shouted from the doorway. Her voice had an edge of excitement to it. Emma rushed outside, brushing aside the dread she had been trying to shake. Lily and Ben were standing at the base of a tall, gnarled tree, their backs to the darkened woods. "What is it?" Emma asked, her gaze following Lily's pointing finger. At first, she thought Lily was pointing to a patch of strange mushrooms growing around the base of the tree, but as Emma stepped closer, she saw something far more disturbing. Embedded in the bark of the tree was a faded symbol, scratched into the wood with what appeared to be something sharp and jagged. It was a crude, spiraling circle with several lines crossing through it, making it look almost like an ancient warning. "I found it," Lily said, her voice oddly quiet. Ben, who was always the more adventurous of the two, was jumping up and down with excitement. "It's like a treasure map," he declared, though his words lacked the usual enthusiasm. "Ben, don't touch it," Emma said sharply, but her words didn't seem to matter. Ben had already reached out to touch the markings. As soon as his fingers made contact with the tree, the wind shifted. It came from nowhere, sharp and cold, pushing through the trees with an eerie, unnatural force. The leaves rustled, but Emma swore she heard something else. Something deeper, older. A voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper lost on the wind. But as Emma strained to listen, she realized it wasn't just wind. It was words. "Leave a leave now." She shook her head, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping up her spine. But Lily was already stepping forward, eyes wide with fascination. She stared at the symbol on the tree, her face pale. "Mom, it says something," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's calling us." Before Emma could stop her, Lily placed her hand on the symbol, her fingers brushing the rough surface of the bark. That's when it happened. A sudden tremor shook the ground beneath them. The air grew thick, heavier than before. The whispering voices grew louder, their tones pleading, desperate. "Get away!" Emma grabbed Lily by the arm, pulling her back with a force she didn't know she had. But it was too late. Ben had already taken several steps into the woods, drawn by some invisible pull. The whispering intensified, swirling around them like a vortex. Emma felt her heart race, her breath shallow as she turned to Jack, who had just arrived on the scene. "What's going on?" he asked, his face pale with confusion. "I don't know," Emma said, her voice shaking. "We need to go. Now." But Ben didn't listen. He continued moving deeper into the trees, his small figure disappearing into the darkness. "Ben!" Emma screamed, but the trees swallowed her voice. Jack grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her back toward the house. "Stay with me," he said, his voice hoarse. "We'll get him. We'll find him." But when they reached the edge of the woods, something had changed. The trees, once dark and menacing, now loomed like twisted sentinels, their branches reaching down like claws, blocking the way. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. And then, as if summoned by some unseen force, the trees parted. A narrow path appeared in the underbrush, winding deeper into the hollow. Without another word, Jack took Emma's hand, and together they ventured forward. The deeper they went into the hollow, the more the world around them seemed to shift. The trees grew impossibly tall, their trunks twisted and gnarled, as if they had grown to bear witness to centuries of horror. The air was thick with mist, and the path ahead of them grew darker with every step. The whispering voices never stopped, they only grew louder, filling the air with a cacophony of distant, unintelligible words. It was as if the very woods were alive, watching them, waiting. Finally, they reached the heart of the hollow. At the center was an ancient stone circle, worn smooth by time and weathered by centuries of exposure. In the center of the circle was a large, jagged rock that seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural glow, and standing in front of it, in a trance-like state, was Ben. "Ben!" Emma shouted, her voice breaking. He didn't respond. His eyes were glassy, his body swaying slightly, as if in some sort of stupor. Before Emma could reach him, a figure stepped forward from the darkness. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, its face hidden beneath a hood. The figure reached out a hand toward Ben, and the moment it did, the whispers stopped. "Leave him alone," Jack yelled, taking a step forward. But the figure didn't respond. It only lifted its hand, pointing at the stone circle, and the ground beneath them trembled. A low, guttural sound filled the air, as if the very earth were crying out in agony. Suddenly, the circle of stones erupted in a burst of light. The ground split open, and from the depths of the earth something rose. It was a shape, an enormous, writhing mass of roots and shadows, its form constantly shifting, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly fire. And then, as the earth groaned and the air thickened with the stench of rot, the hollow itself began to scream. Days later, the town of Raven Hollow was unchanged. The sun rose and set, and the people went about their business, pretending that nothing had happened. But the hollow itself, was silent. No one spoke of what had transpired, but the whispers had grown louder, more insistent. There was one story, though, that would never be forgotten. They said that when the wind blew through the trees of Raven Hollow, you could still hear the voices. And some claimed that on certain nights, if you ventured too close to the woods, you might just catch sight of a figure, a small child standing in the trees, staring out into the world, waiting for someone to come. There was an old house on the hill. Greystone Manor, they called it. It was a looming, decaying structure, its windows dark and foreboding, as if no light could ever penetrate the shadows inside. The town of Ravenswood, nestled in the valley below, had long avoided the place. The house stood as a silent sentinel, watching the town with its vacant eyes, as though it knew all the town's secrets. No one really knew its history. Some whispered that it had once been a grand estate, home to wealthy and powerful men. Others said that it was cursed, a place where the spirits of the dead wandered freely. Few were brave enough to go near the manor, and those who did often never returned, or returned broken, changed, as if they had seen something that shattered their sanity. But then one day a family moved in. The Harrisons, a young couple with 2 small children, had been looking for a fresh start. They found Greystone Manor for a price too good to be true, nestled in the dense woods on the outskirts of Ravenswood. The house was grand in its own way, with ivy climbing up its stone walls and a towering front gate that creaked ominously in the wind. The kind of place that would have been charming if it weren't so isolated. There was something about it, though, something that tugged at the back of their minds, an instinctive unease. But the Harrisons ignored it. After all, they were looking for peace, not superstition. The first night, they sat around the old, marble fireplace in the grand living room, the fire crackling and casting flickering shadows on the walls. Lily, the youngest child at 6 years old, seemed to take an immediate liking to the house. She ran from room to room, giggling and exploring as if the manor were her personal playground. Her older brother, Matthew, was a bit more skeptical, but he too could not resist the allure of the grand staircase and the long corridors. Everything seemed perfect at first. But by the second night, things began to change. It started with small things. The flickering of lights that couldn't be explained. The creaking of floorboards when no one was walking on them. Strange noises in the middle of the night, whispers, like faint voices coming from behind the walls. On the third day, they found something truly unsettling. Lily had wandered into the old cellar, drawn by some unseen force. When she returned, she was holding something in her hands, a small, ornate key, rusted and old, like it had been buried in the earth for centuries. She said she had found it in the darkest corner of the cellar, where the shadows seemed to reach for her. "Mommy, it was calling me," she said, her voice quiet and distant. The key was strange, almost too perfect in its design, yet covered in a layer of dirt that suggested it had not been touched in years, if not decades. The family didn't think much of it at the time, but as the days wore on, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered more frequently, the whispers grew louder, and Matthew began having nightmares. The dreams were always the same. He would be standing in the hallway, unable to move, as something cold and monstrous reached out from the shadows. It was the 4th night when things took a darker turn. Lily had been playing near the attic door when she vanished. No one saw her go. One moment, she was there, humming a soft tune, and the next, she was gone. Her parents searched the house frantically, calling her name, but the house was too vast, too silent, and too oppressive. They found no sign of her in any room, no trail, no clue as to where she had gone. When Matthew came running to them, his face ashen and terrified, he said only 2 words, "She's in there." Without thinking, the Harrisons followed Matthew up the narrow staircase to the attic, the air growing colder with each step. The attic door was cracked open, despite no one having touched it. Lily's giggles echoed through the narrow space, but they were distorted, hollow, as though they were coming from far away. They entered the attic. The room was massive, filled with old furniture, cobwebs, and dust. But there, standing in the farthest corner, was Lily. She was staring at something, her back turned toward them. "Lily," her mother called, her voice shaking. "What are you doing up here?" Lily didn't respond. Her body was still unnaturally so. Then, without warning, she turned, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her skin was pale, and her pupils were dilated, as if she were in a trance. "The key," she whispered, her voice hollow and distant. It opened the door. Emma, her mother, felt a chill run through her spine. She had no idea what Lily meant, but instinct told her something was terribly wrong. "Lily, let's go," she urged, reaching out for her daughter. But as she stepped forward, the attic door slammed shut with a deafening thud, plunging the room into darkness. The family was trapped. Panic surged through Emma's chest as she fumbled for her phone, only to find there was no signal. The temperature dropped, and a strange, oppressive silence filled the room. The only sound was the faint scratching noise, as if something were moving in the shadows. Suddenly a voice, a deep, raspy voice, whispered from the darkness. "She belongs to us now." The Harrisons froze. The voice wasn't human. It was older, ancient. And it was coming from everywhere, from within the walls, from the very floorboards beneath their feet. "What do you want?" Jack demanded, his voice trembling. The voice responded with a low, guttural laugh. "The manor is hungry. It always has been. And you," the voice paused, as if savoring the words. "You are the feast." Lily's eyes began to glow faintly, a sickly, unnatural green. Her body jerked, as if something unseen were controlling her. Her mouth opened, but the words that came out were not hers. "The key, it unlocks the curse. You should never have come. The manor is alive." And then, without warning, the walls of the attic seemed to breathe. The floorboards warped and groaned under the pressure of something far below. The house itself was stirring, waking up, and it was angry. Jack lunged forward, grabbing Lily and pulling her toward the stairs. But as he did, the shadows in the corners of the room stretched and reached out like tendrils, wrapping around them. The air thickened with the smell of decay, and the temperature plummeted even further. "Run!" Jack shouted, but they couldn't escape. No matter how hard they tried, the house wouldn't let them go. They were trapped, caught in the grip of something ancient and malevolent, a force that had waited centuries for someone, anyone, to awaken it. The next morning, Greystone Manor sat silently on the hill, its dark windows staring out over the town of Ravenswood. The Harrisons had vanished without a trace. Some said the house had claimed them. Others believed they had simply left, unable to cope with the isolation of the manor. But no one truly knew. As for Greystone Manor, it remained as it always had, standing like a monument to the darkness that it contained, waiting for the next souls to wander too close. The ruins of Blackwood Asylum had loomed over Black Hollow Valley for nearly a century, perched on a hill where lightning seemed to strike every time a storm rolled in. To the people of the nearby town, it was a dark reminder of a past better left forgotten. Built in the late 1800s, the asylum was once a sanctuary for societies lost and broken, though the doctors there did little to heal them. Instead, they'd experimented with therapies and cures that were horrific even by the standards of their time. After a mysterious fire in 1923 claimed the lives of dozens of patients and staff, the asylum closed its doors for good. No one knew how the fire had started, and no one cared enough to find out. The asylum became a place of shadows and whispers, feared by those who lived nearby. Townsfolk spoke of voices that echoed through the valley, of lights that flickered in the empty windows on dark nights. Parents warned their children never to go near it. But warnings don't always work, and curiosity can be a powerful force. Years passed, and the asylum lay forgotten, buried under layers of dust and silence, until one day, a group of urban explorers arrived in Black Hollow Valley. They were young and reckless, armed with cameras and flashlights, eager to capture something terrifying on film. They had heard the legends, of course, but they were skeptical. Ghost stories were good for clicks and views. No one actually believed them. The leader of the group, Tyler, was particularly eager to be the first to film the asylum's haunted halls. "Just think of the footage we'll get," he said, excitement gleaming in his eyes as they stood at the asylum's crumbling gates. His girlfriend, Sarah, clung to his arm, casting nervous glances at the dark, towering building. "I don't like this, Tyler," she whispered. "This place feels wrong." But Tyler brushed her off, laughing. "Come on, Sarah, it's just an old building. What could possibly happen?" As they made their way through the gates, the asylum seemed to come alive around them. The air grew colder, and a strange silence fell over the group as they stepped inside. The floors were covered in broken glass, and the smell of mildew and decay clung to the air. Their footsteps echoed down the long, empty corridors, which seemed to stretch on forever, dark and filled with shadows. Their first stop was the main lobby, where the old reception desk still stood, covered in dust and cobwebs. Tyler pulled out his camera, grinning as he pointed it toward the darkness. "All right, let's start here. Sarah, want to be my co-host?" Sarah rolled her eyes but agreed, stepping into the camera's view. "Welcome to Blackwood Asylum," she said, her voice shaky. "Home of unspeakable horrors and mysterious deaths." They laughed, trying to shake off the sense of dread that clung to the air. But as they continued exploring, something changed. The hallways seemed to shift, leading them in circles. The shadows grew darker, and the temperature dropped so low that they could see their breath. "Is anyone else feeling weird?" asked Jake, one of their friends. Like we're being watched." As if in response, a faint whisper echoed down the hallway. It was barely audible, but they all heard it, soft, like the rustling of leaves. "Did you guys hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. Tyler grinned, but his voice was shaky. "Probably just the wind. Come on, let's check out the basement. That's where they say the experiments happened." They made their way down a narrow staircase, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The basement was worse than the rest of the asylum. It was cold, damp, and filled with the faint smell of burnt wood. As they walked, they noticed old equipment lying around, rusted gurneys, broken wheelchairs, and strange, metal tools that looked more like torture devices than medical instruments. And then they found the room. It was small and windowless, with walls covered in dark stains. Chains hung from the walls, and a single chair sat in the center of the room, bolted to the floor. Tyler aimed his camera at the chair, his excitement tempered by unease. This is it," he whispered. "This is where they kept the lost ones. The patients they didn't know what to do with." As they filmed, Sarah noticed something strange on the walls. At first, she thought it was just old graffiti, but as she looked closer, she realized they were words, scratched into the walls in a haphazard scrawl. "Save me. They won't stop. I am still here. They won't stop. I am still here." Her blood ran cold. "Tyler, we need to leave. Now." But Tyler was too engrossed in his filming to listen. "Just a little longer. This is amazing. Look at these." Before he could finish, the door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the basement, and they all froze, their breaths caught in their throats. Did you guys close that?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. No one had touched the door. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted even further, and a deep, guttural moan filled the room. It was a sound unlike anything they had ever heard, a voice that was both ancient and filled with agony. And then they saw it. A figure stood in the corner of the room, shrouded in darkness. It was tall, impossibly thin, its face obscured by shadows. But its eyes glowed with a sickly, unnatural light, filled with rage and despair. The figure began to move, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it stepped forward, closer and closer. Sarah screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. Tyler dropped the camera, his face pale as he backed away. "Run," he whispered. "Everyone run." They scrambled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was getting closer, its eyes fixed on them with a hunger that went beyond mere malice. It was as if the thing had been waiting for them, biding its time, hungry for the living. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The figure vanished, and the door creaked open. Without a second thought, they bolted, their footsteps pounding through the corridors as they raced for the exit. The whispers followed them, echoing through the halls, growing louder and more frantic. As they burst through the front doors, the asylum seemed to let out a sigh, as though it were disappointed to lose them. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of town. Later that night, when they looked back at the footage, they saw something they hadn't noticed before. The figure had been following them from the moment they entered the asylum, appearing in every corner of the frame, watching them with those unblinking, glowing eyes. They never returned to Blackwood Asylum. And no one else has either. Some say that if you listen closely at night, you can still hear the whispers of the lost ones, calling out from the hill where Blackwood Asylum once stood, waiting for someone to set them free. The town of Riverview had a reputation. To outsiders, it seemed quaint, a close-knit community with winding country roads, farms stretching over the hills, and a modest forest that hugged the eastern side of town like a quiet guardian. But to those who lived there, Riverview was haunted by secrets. Stories of strange sounds, sudden disappearances, and half-glimpsed figures in the woods had whispered through generations. And no story was more chilling than that of the Watcher. They called it the Watcher because no one knew exactly what it was. For as long as the oldest residents could remember, people claimed to see a figure lurking in the woods, mostly at dusk or early dawn. It wasn't a person or an animal, they said, but something in between, a tall, twisted shadow with hollow, staring eyes that sometimes looked back at you from the treeline. The few who ventured deep into the woods and saw the Watcher up close came back changed. They wouldn't talk about what they saw. Some simply left Riverview and never returned. It was an unspoken rule in town to leave the woods alone. But Ellie McGowan had never been one to follow rules. She was a college sophomore with a taste for the supernatural and a love for solving mysteries. So when she came home for winter break, the story of the Watcher became her new obsession. "It's just a silly town legend, Mom," she said one evening as she pored over her grandfather's old journal, reading about his own encounter with the Watcher back in the 1970s. "Legends don't just come from nowhere," her mother replied, her voice tense as she scrubbed at a pan in the sink. "Your grandfather never talked about what he saw out there, and whatever it was, it scared him enough to keep him out of those woods for the rest of his life." Ellie rolled her eyes. "But what did he see? How could something just look at you and change you?" Her mother stopped scrubbing and looked at her with dark, wary eyes. "All I know is that he wouldn't even look at trees anymore. Said he'd always see those eyes watching him. Just promise me you won't go out there, Ellie." Ellie didn't promise. Instead, she planned. The next morning, she packed a bag with a flashlight, snacks, her grandfather's old hunting knife, and a small camera. She also brought his journal, hoping it might help her piece together where he'd seen the Watcher. She left early, when the mist was still clinging to the trees, painting them with a heavy, eerie silence. The forest seemed harmless, even peaceful, under the blanket of fog, and she felt the thrill of excitement more than any fear. After a mile or so, she found herself on an old, overgrown path. She scanned her grandfather's notes, stopping when she reached a passage that described a strange tree deep within the woods, gnarled and twisted as if it had grown with a burden. As she walked deeper, the trees began to close in, growing taller, their branches gnarled and reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air felt heavy, and there was an unnatural stillness. Not even the birds dared to sing here. Ellie could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on her, but she pushed forward, her heart pounding. After another hour, she came to the tree described in her grandfather's journal. It was impossible to mistake. The trunk was split into two halves, twisted together at the base but stretched apart as they grew up, forming a shape like a jagged mouth. The bark was scarred, its surface pocked with strange marks. She took out her camera, snapping pictures of the tree and the area around it. She was so focused on the camera that she almost didn't notice the whisper. It was faint, like the rustling of leaves, but it wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from behind her. She froze, every hair on her body standing on end. She turned slowly, her heart racing, her breath caught in her throat. There was nothing there. She exhaled shakily and laughed. "Calm down, Ellie. It's just the wind." But as she turned back, she felt it again, a presence watching her. She looked around, trying to shake off the feeling. She forced herself to examine the tree again, pressing her hand against the bark. The wood felt unnaturally cold, as if it were sucking the warmth from her skin. She jerked her hand away, and then noticed something strange at the base of the tree. Footprints. She knelt down, examining them. They were human, but the impressions were deep, too deep, as though something impossibly heavy had pressed down into the soft earth. She looked closer and noticed scratch marks beside the footprints, like someone, or something, had been dragged. Suddenly, she heard the whisper again, clearer this time. "Ellie!" Her heart skipped. It was her name. She turned, scanning the trees. Nothing but darkness and mist. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. Only silence answered. She was about to turn back when she caught sight of something moving between the trees. It was there for a split second, a shadow, a tall, dark figure with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. They were hollow, bottomless, staring directly at her. Ellie's legs locked in place. She couldn't move, couldn't look away. Those eyes held her, piercing into her like shards of ice. The figure tilted its head, watching her with an intent that felt ancient and malevolent. It stepped forward, its body twisting unnaturally, like it was bending in ways that defied anatomy. Ellie could see it clearly now. A gaunt, skeletal figure with skin stretched tightly over its frame, its mouth twisted into a wide, toothless grin. "Ellie," it whispered again, but this time, the voice was different. Familiar. Her heart hammered as she recognized it. It was her grandfather's voice, the voice she'd heard in old recordings. But it was warped, like it was echoing from some dark, twisted place. "Grandpa," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The thing grinned wider, as if mocking her. "Ellie, you shouldn't be here." She backed away, her body trembling. The thing took a step forward, moving with an unnatural grace, like it was floating just above the ground. "Ellie," it hissed, stretching its hand toward her. Panicking, she turned and ran, crashing through the trees, branches slapping her face, her feet slipping on the muddy ground. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear it following her, its footsteps unnaturally soft but constant, relentless. She tripped and fell, the camera tumbling from her bag and snapping a picture as it hit the ground. Scrambling to her feet, she glanced back and saw the figure standing over her camera, those hollow eyes staring directly into the lens, as if looking through it and into her soul. She didn't stop running until she burst out of the trees and into her backyard, her chest heaving, her lungs burning. She stumbled into the house, slamming the door behind her, locking it and pressing her back against it as if that thin piece of wood could keep the thing out. Her mother found her there, shaking and pale, and Ellie barely managed to stammer out what had happened. Her mother's face darkened, her expression a mix of fear and anger. "I told you not to go out there," she whispered, her voice trembling. For days, Ellie barely slept, haunted by the memory of those hollow eyes. But the worst came when she developed the pictures on her camera. Most of them were normal, trees, footprints, the twisted trunk. But the last photo made her blood run cold. It showed the figure, standing in front of the camera, its eyes staring directly at her. And though the picture was still, those eyes felt alive, as if they were looking right at her even now. Ellie threw the picture away, but no matter how many times she tried to get rid of it, she'd always find it back in her room, tucked under her pillow, or slipped into her bag, the figure's hollow eyes watching her, as if it was waiting. Over the next few weeks, Ellie's mother began noticing changes in her daughter. Ellie had always been bright, full of life, but now she was pale, her eyes shadowed, her hands constantly shaking. She began avoiding mirrors, refusing to go near windows, always glancing over her shoulder as if she was being watched. And then one night she disappeared. Her mother called the police, but they found no signs of struggle, no clues to where she might have gone. All they found was her camera, lying at the edge of the woods. The last picture on it was of Ellie, her face pale, her eyes hollow and staring, the same twisted smile etched across her face. They searched the woods, but no one ever found her. Years passed, and Ellie became another cautionary tale, a new chapter in the legend of the Watcher. People said that if you went into the woods at dusk, you could still see her there, a tall, thin figure with hollow eyes, watching you from the trees, waiting for someone to join her. The town of Riverview stayed quiet after that. People didn't talk about Ellie, or her grandfather, or the Watcher. But every now and then, someone would hear a whisper in the woods, a soft voice calling their name, luring them deeper, until they too were lost. And the Watcher kept watching, waiting for the next soul brave, or foolish, enough to step into the trees. Sarah always thought her childhood home was special. Her parents had moved into the old Victorian house when she was 5, and though it was well-worn, it had character. With its creaky floors, narrow staircases, and sprawling attic, the house felt more alive than any home she'd known. Yet, the attic was a place Sarah rarely visited. There was something about it that always felt wrong. Now in her 20s, Sarah had just returned to her family home to settle her late parents' affairs. Standing in the hallway, she could feel the memories clinging to the walls, whispering in the stillness. Yet beneath the nostalgia, a vague unease prickled at her. The house felt different, as though something dark and unsettled had taken root over the years. The attic was the last part of the house she wanted to clean. It was dim and dusty, filled with things her parents had collected but never had the heart to throw away. She steeled herself, holding a flashlight in one hand, and slowly climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning under her weight. As she opened the attic door, the familiar smell of stale wood and mothballs enveloped her. She swept her flashlight across the room, and memories flooded back. A trunk of her mother's clothes, her father's old fishing gear, a stack of her own childhood books. But one thing stood out, a small, unmarked door at the far end of the attic that she had never noticed before. It was odd, almost absurd, that she'd missed it. Sarah stepped closer, squinting as her flashlight illuminated the door's surface. The wood was a dark, oily black, entirely unlike the rest of the attic, and it bore a single faint marking, a circle with 3 intersecting lines. She traced her finger over the symbol, feeling a chill spread through her. Something inside her whispered that she should leave it alone. But curiosity got the better of her. She twisted the handle and pushed the door open, wincing as it creaked loudly. Inside was a small, cramped room with low ceilings, dust particles swirling in the dim light from her flashlight. It was mostly empty, save for a single object in the center, a tall, full-length mirror with an ornate black frame carved with twisted, interlocking vines. Its surface was cloudy, as if it hadn't been cleaned in years. Sarah approached it cautiously, her heart pounding as she caught sight of her own reflection. But her reflection looked wrong. It was her, yes, but her face was blank, expressionless, her eyes hollow and dark. She took a step back, heart pounding, and blinked, willing the strange image away. When she looked again, her reflection had returned to normal, though a strange coldness lingered. "Get a grip, Sarah," she whispered, shaking off the feeling. "It's just an old mirror." She turned to leave, but as she reached the door, she heard something, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the direction of the mirror. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it echoed in her ears. Against her better judgment, she looked back at the mirror. Her reflection was still there, staring at her. But this time it was smiling. Sarah's skin prickled as she realized her own face hadn't moved. She wasn't smiling. The figure in the mirror tilted its head, the grin widening as it raised a hand and tapped on the glass. The tapping continued, faster now, echoing around her. It was almost as if it were laughing. She took a step back, her stomach churning with dread. The reflection's face changed, twisting and contorting, its features melting and reforming into a shadowy mask, its eyes black and endless. "Sarah," it whispered, the voice raspy and mocking. "Why did you leave me here?" Her heart stopped. The voice was hers. The figure pressed its hands against the glass, its mouth stretching into a horrible, unnatural grin. "Let me out, Sarah." She stumbled backward, fumbling for the door, her hands shaking. She yanked it open, slamming it shut behind her, and ran down the stairs, barely able to breathe. When she reached the bottom, she leaned against the wall, heart racing, trying to make sense of what she'd seen. The house was silent, but she could still hear the faint, insistent tapping, echoing from the attic above. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that twisted reflection grinning back at her, its hollow eyes following her, mocking her. The tapping continued, faint but steady, and it seemed to be getting closer. She could almost hear a whisper beneath it, a soft, insistent voice calling her name. By dawn, she couldn't stand it anymore. She went back up to the attic, determined to face whatever it was. The tapping stopped as she reached the door, and the silence that followed was thick, pressing down on her like a weight. She hesitated, her hand trembling as it reached for the handle. But she couldn't turn back now. She opened the door to the small room. The mirror was gone. She blinked, her mind reeling, but there was no trace of it. The room was empty. She stepped inside, searching for any sign of the mirror or the strange figure she'd seen. But the room was silent, empty, as though nothing had ever been there. Relieved but still unnerved, she returned to her room, hoping it had all been some strange nightmare. But as she lay in bed, she heard it again, a faint tapping, closer this time, like it was coming from just outside her door. She threw the covers over her head, her heart pounding. She lay there, clutching the blanket, listening as the tapping grew louder, closer, until it was right next to her bed. She held her breath, terrified of what she might see if she looked. The tapping stopped. A soft, whispering voice filled the silence. "Sarah, look at me." She clenched her eyes shut, refusing to open them. "I'm right here, Sarah. Don't you want to see me?" The whisper was right next to her ear now, soft and mocking, dripping with malice. She felt something cold brush against her cheek, and she bit back a scream, her entire body trembling. "Sarah," the voice whispered again, growing fainter, as though it were fading back into the darkness. "I'll be watching." The whisper trailed off, leaving her in silence once more. She spent the rest of the night wide awake, clutching the blanket, waiting for the tapping to return. But it didn't. Morning came, and the house was silent, still. She forced herself to go about her day, but the memory of the voice, the cold touch on her cheek, lingered. Over the next few days, the tapping came and went, sometimes faint, sometimes closer, but always there, following her. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, she would catch a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye, a shadowy figure, a twisted smile, a pair of dark, hollow eyes watching her. As the days passed, she became obsessed with the mirror, convinced it was still somewhere in the house. She searched every room, every closet, every corner, but it was gone, as though it had never existed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she returned to her room and froze. There, leaning against the wall, was the mirror. She stared at it, her heart pounding, her skin prickling with dread. She could feel something watching her from the other side, waiting. Slowly, she approached it, her body tense, every nerve screaming at her to run. But she couldn't look away. Her reflection was there, smiling that horrible, twisted smile. The figure pressed its hand against the glass, beckoning her. "Come closer, Sarah," it whispered, its voice low and inviting. She took a step forward, mesmerized, unable to resist the pull. The reflection grinned wider, its eyes dark and endless, as it reached out, fingers pressing against the glass, reaching for her. "Let me out," it whispered, its voice a desperate, twisted plea. "I need you, Sarah." She reached out, her hand trembling, her fingers brushing the cold surface of the mirror. The glass rippled beneath her touch, as though it were water, pulling her hand in. She tried to pull away, but it was too late. The mirror was like quicksand, sucking her in, the figure's hands closing around her wrist, pulling her closer, its grin widening as it whispered in her ear. "Welcome home, Sarah." With one final, desperate scream, she was pulled into the mirror, her body vanishing into the darkness. The house was silent. Days later, a neighbor noticed that Sarah's house had been quiet for far too long. When no one answered the door, they called the police. The house was empty, with no sign of where Sarah had gone. But in her bedroom, they found a mirror leaning against the wall. It was old, with an ornate black frame, carved with twisted vines. The surface was cloudy, but if you looked closely, you could see something faint, deep within the glass. A pair of hollow, staring eyes, and a twisted, desperate smile. If you listened carefully, you could almost hear it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from inside the mirror, as if someone on the other side was trying to get out. It started as a quiet, nagging feeling for Emma, a sense that someone was watching her. She'd just moved into her new apartment, an old, creaky building at the edge of town that had once been a boarding house back in the early 1900s. The walls were thin, the air carried a permanent smell of dust and mildew, and the layout of the apartment was strange, with rooms arranged at odd angles, casting shadows in every corner. It was supposed to be temporary, just a cheap place to stay while she got on her feet. But from the first night, something felt off. The first night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She blamed it on exhaustion, tossing and turning, pulling the blankets up to her chin as her eyes darted around the dark room. At one point, she could have sworn she saw a figure standing in the far corner, near the closet, just barely visible in the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through her blinds. But when she turned on her bedside lamp, the corner was empty. Just a shadow cast by a stray coat hanging on the wall, she told herself. But the feeling didn't go away. The next morning, she mentioned it to her neighbor, Mrs. Hart, an elderly woman who had lived in the building for decades. Mrs. Hart's face darkened, her eyes narrowing. "You saw him, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice low and quivering. Emma laughed, brushing it off. "Saw who?" Mrs. Hart leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "The man in the corner. He's been here a long time, since before I moved in. He doesn't like it when people see him." A chill ran down Emma's spine. She forced a laugh, trying to shake off the old woman's words. "It's just shadows. Old houses like these always have a few spooky corners." But Mrs. Hart didn't smile. Her eyes were distant, haunted. "Just don't look too long. He doesn't like it." Emma left, dismissing Mrs. Hart's words as the ramblings of a lonely, eccentric woman. But that night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the man in the corner. She found herself glancing at the same spot by her closet, her heart pounding as she felt that same prickling sensation on the back of her neck. The figure was there again, a vague, human-like shadow, almost imperceptible in the darkness. She stared at it, unable to tear her eyes away, telling herself it was just her imagination. But the longer she looked, the clearer it became. She could see a faint outline, broad shoulders, a slouching posture, a head tilted slightly to the side. And then it moved. The figure shifted, its head tilting just a fraction as if noticing her gaze. Emma's breath caught, her body freezing in terror. She wanted to scream, to reach for the lamp, to do anything, but she couldn't move, couldn't look away. She was paralyzed, her eyes locked on the figure, which now seemed to be staring back at her. Finally, she broke free from her trance, fumbling for the lamp and flicking it on. The corner was empty. Just shadows. But the feeling of being watched lingered, crawling over her skin like insects. The following nights were worse. She would catch glimpses of him out of the corner of her eye, standing in the hallway, sitting at the foot of her bed, even crouching in her bathroom. But whenever she tried to look directly at him, he would vanish. She slept with every light on, but it didn't help. She could feel him watching her from every corner, from behind every door. After a week of restless, haunted nights, Emma couldn't take it anymore. She called a friend, Sam, and begged him to come stay with her for a few nights. When he arrived, she felt a wave of relief, hoping that having someone else around would chase away whatever was haunting her. The first night with Sam was peaceful. They laughed, watched movies, and talked late into the night, Emma almost forgetting about the man in the corner. She even managed to sleep through the night for the first time since moving in. But the next night, things changed. Around 3 a.m, Emma woke up with a jolt, her skin prickling with a familiar dread. She sat up, glancing around the room, her heart pounding as she felt the air grow thick, oppressive. She reached out, shaking Sam awake. "Sam, he's here. I can feel him." Sam blinked, groggy and confused. "Who?" Emma pointed to the corner near the closet. "Him. He's standing right there." Sam sighed, rubbing his eyes. "Emma, there's nothing there. It's dark, your mind's playing tricks on you." Emma gritted her teeth, desperation creeping into her voice. "Please, Sam. Just look." Reluctantly, Sam turned toward the corner. He squinted, his face falling as he saw what she was pointing at. "What the—" The figure was there, its outline faint but unmistakable. A tall, dark shape, its head tilted as it stared back at them. Sam's face paled, his voice a horrified whisper. "Emma, what is that?" Emma grabbed his arm, pulling him closer. "That's him. That's the man in the corner." Sam tried to tear his eyes away, but he couldn't. The two of them sat there, paralyzed with fear, watching as the figure slowly began to move, shuffling toward them, its form shifting and melting in the darkness like it was made of shadows. "Don't look at him," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "Just don't look at him." But it was too late. The man in the corner was standing at the foot of the bed now, towering over them, his form filling the room with a thick, oppressive darkness. His head tilted slowly, his face still hidden in shadow, but they could feel his gaze boring into them. Suddenly, the figure lurched forward, and the room went pitch black. Emma felt a cold, skeletal hand wrap around her wrist, pulling her, dragging her into the darkness. She screamed, thrashing, but the grip was relentless, pulling her deeper into the void. She could hear Sam screaming beside her, his voice fading as the darkness closed in around them. When Emma woke up, she was alone. The room was silent, the shadows still. She looked around, her heart pounding as she realized Sam was gone. She searched the entire apartment, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Desperate, she went to Mrs. Hart, pounding on her door, begging for help. "He took him," she sobbed. "The man in the corner, he took Sam." Mrs. Hart's face darkened, her expression grim. "He's taken people before. Those who see him too clearly, they don't come back." Emma's heart sank, despair washing over her. "What can I do? How do I get him back?" Mrs. Hart hesitated, then handed her an old, dusty book. "There's an incantation in here. It might give you a glimpse of where he's taken your friend. But be warned, child, once you see the other side, you may never come back." Emma didn't hesitate. She took the book and locked herself in her apartment, her hands shaking as she found the incantation and read it aloud. The air grew thick, the walls seeming to melt around her, the shadows twisting and writhing. And then she was there. She was standing in a dark, endless void, the floor a swirling, shadowy mist. In the distance, she saw figures, people, drifting aimlessly, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. She saw Sam among them, his face slack, his eyes empty, his body trapped in a slow, agonizing drift. "Sam," she cried, running toward him. But the closer she got, the further away he seemed, as though the shadows themselves were pulling him back. Then she felt it, a cold, familiar presence behind her. She turned, and there he was. The man in the corner, his shadowy form towering over her, his head tilted, his empty gaze fixed on her with an expression that might have been a smile. She tried to scream, to run, but the shadows closed in around her, pulling her back, wrapping around her like chains. The last thing she saw was Sam's face, fading into the darkness as the man in the corner leaned in close, his whisper filling her mind. "You look too long, Emma." The void swallowed her, and everything went black. Days later, the landlord unlocked Emma's apartment to investigate the strange smell seeping from under her door. Inside, he found nothing but a thick layer of dust and an odd silence that seemed to hang in the air. But some say if you stand in Emma's old apartment at night, you can still feel it, the prickling sensation of being watched, the faint whisper of voices lost to the shadows, and in the darkest corner, a tall, shadowy figure, watching and waiting for someone else to look too long.